This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India-US strengthening strategic and economic relations. The participants are Professor Harsh V. Pant, Strategic Analyst, and Gaura Dhawan Lal, Anchor.
Hello and welcome to our program. Today we shall be talking about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first state visit to the United States of America, which is currently ongoing. And we are delighted to have with us in the studio Dr. Harsh V. Pant, the Strategic Analyst. Dr. Harsh, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Gaura.
The Prime Minister has been very often, and a fair number of times in the last few years, as Prime Minister to the U.S., but this is his first state visit. If you could just share with us the different dynamics that a state visit brings in.
State visit, in some ways, is a recognition by the U.S. government and the White House of the special esteem that they hold a particular leader, a particular nation in when they invite the leader of that country for a visit of this kind. So the fact that Prime Minister Modi is being invited, has been invited for the state visit at a very critical juncture, both in global geopolitics as well as U.S.-India relations, at a very transformative moment at this stage, is an indication that India-US relationship has moved significantly beyond what perhaps anyone would have anticipated a few years back. When Prime Minister Modi went to the US soon after his election in 2014, he addressed the US Congress, and when he addressed the US Congress, he mentioned a very famous phrase that the hesitations of history are over. There was always a hesitation in India in acknowledging how important America is for India's strategic ambitions. That Prime Minister perhaps was hinting that era was over. Slowly but surely he has built over the last 9 years a relationship with the US, which today is very, very unique because India continues to stand on its own 2 feet, if you will, in terms of its own independent foreign policy, its own strategic autonomy, as we have seen, for example, in the Ukraine crisis, but at the same time has not been reluctant to embrace the US, openly acknowledge US's importance, as the Prime Minister has done in some of his recent comments as well. So I think there is a recognition in both Washington and New Delhi. This inflection point is an opportunity to craft new relationship with India, and I think in that sense, the state visit assumes significance both in what it represents as far as the US is concerned and what it might bring to the table insofar as the future of Indo-US relationship is concerned.
Dr. Harsh, the geopolitics of the world at a particular point of time play a huge role in determining a lot of international relations. So now we do agree that, of course, both countries have a lot to gain from collaborative relationships. What do you think is the change in America's stance in view as to how it views India today as a regional and a global entity?
I think one of the most important changes that we have seen in the US with India is that, of course, that old dehyphenation with Pakistan was over for a while. But I think what we are also now looking at is America looking at India as an actor that can stand up for its own interests. For example, the fact that we are standing up to China along the border, as well as the fact that India can also work with other countries in providing constructive solutions to the global problems. And I think COVID and what has happened in Russia-Ukraine war and what has happened with the China aggression, all of that has brought India to the spotlight. The fact that democracy, with all its challenges, continues to gain momentum in India. The fact that India continues to work hard in achieving its economic ambitions. The fact that India is today the fastest growing major economy in the world. And the fact that India is increasingly providing solutions to problems like COVID, for example. Our Vaccine Maitri program, very, very important. So I think all that has altered the perception of India, which is always complaining about the global order, to an India which is now constructively engaged in shaping the global order. And in that, I think there has been a remarkable shift, both in India's own evolution as well as in America's appreciation of that evolution. So that would, in some ways, has been the defining element in how America has looked at India. And we have seen that gradually across different administrations. When Mr. Modi started his tenure in 2014, Barack Obama was there, former president. Then we saw Donald Trump come in, very mercurial Republican president. And then we have seen Biden, another Democrat, coming in. And across 3 administrations, there were many changes, but one significant consistency was how all of them wanted to engage India. And once again, the state visit is an acknowledgement of the fact how important a role Mr. Modi has played in building that relationship and how they view India as a very important anchor in the way geopolitics is evolving.
So when we talk of any relationship between two countries, I think people-to-people contact and cultural initiatives or commonalities and diversity play a huge role. Indian diaspora, we have a huge one there in the US of A. How important has been their role currently, and how do you see it panning out in the future?
One of the most important and interesting aspects of India-US relationship has been that it is not simply driven by the top leadership. Of course, as we were discussing over the last few minutes, Mr. Modi and successive different administrations of the US have played a very important role. But it is also about people-to-people engagement and how closely intertwined people are in both countries. Indian diaspora has played a very important role in cementing this relationship. Indians are increasingly very, very prominent economically. They are also becoming very prominent politically in the US. And I think that sense that we have diaspora that is increasingly shaping the trajectory of this relationship has been a very important dynamic. We saw the rise of this diaspora during the discussions on Indo-US nuclear deal, where the diaspora played a very important role in convincing US Congress of the importance of that deal. And that has paid off. But today the diaspora is very visible, not only economically, but also politically. The US Congress, where we have several Indian origin congressmen and women. Of course, the Vice President of the US is of Indian origin. And of course, there are a number of other players, the top level hierarchies of the both parties. So Indian diaspora is evolving in a manner that perhaps we had not visualized just a decade back. And suddenly now they are very prominent, they are very politically potent. And that has an impact which is quite apparent, and I think it will also be apparent during Mr. Modi's visit when the diaspora will come together in honoring the Prime Minister, and in honoring the Prime Minister, they'll be honoring their country of origin, India. So I think it's a very significant moment for the diaspora as well, that the diaspora continues to play the role of a bridge between these two very, very important democracies.
And in terms of when we see a diaspora which has traditional roots in one country, whether it's 2 generations or 3 generations ago, and a sensitivity they bring to another picture which can be actually so objective that it misses out certain sensitivities. And with them having that objectivity of living in another country and yet being able to see the two perspectives, that's what brings a nice all-roundedness to any decision which is taken with collaboration.
That's exactly the role, perhaps, that Indian diaspora is maturing in the US has done. Often when you have American media or American commentariat reporting on India, often not attuned to the realities on the ground, it is the Indian diaspora that has made an important contribution in recalibrating those assessments and making it clear to the American policymakers that, look, India, with all its challenges, major democracy that is trying to do same things that America, hundreds of years ago was trying to do. So I think that sensitivity, that all-roundedness that comes by having that second and third generation of diaspora, which is increasingly potent in ways perhaps it was not a few years ago. I think that's the issue here. And in some ways that differentiates Indian diaspora from many other diasporas in the US.
Dr. Harsh, in terms of trading partners, US is our biggest trading partner. How do you view the existing export-import balance between the two countries, and what are some areas of opportunity for India to actually bring this balance more in their favor?
I think the opportunities for India and the US are growing. And what is going to be very, very interesting phase is because we are focusing increasingly on technology and defense cooperation, that is going to, in some ways rebalance this relationship. We are also seeing an acknowledgement that certain sectors which have not been very open in both countries vis-a-vis each other, that those sectors will be relooked at. We have seen, for example, health after COVID becoming one such sector. We are also looking at perhaps some engagement on some of the more sensitive sectors like the agriculture sector. But I think broadly what is also interesting is the broader engagement that is happening on economics, which is not simply about bilateral trade, but how do we look at the global economic architecture? How do we think of supply chains restructuring, for example? As American companies look away from the US, from China, India presents them an exciting opportunity, and we have already seen companies like Apple, for example, making huge bets on India. We have seen technology companies making huge bets on India's future. And I think that in itself will bring a certain semblance of balance in the relationship that has been lopsided, and that has been a problem for many of our engagements in the past. But as the trust factor grows, and as economic relations more and more about trust, which is the new normal today, that like-minded countries working together on economic and trade matters, I think we are going to see a new momentum in our economic ties, which are already growing by the day.
So when we talk of a global economic architecture, we also know that when we see the flow of resources across the world, the flow of capital is freely accepted. India is also rich in human capital and human resource. Do you think that a free flow of labor or human capital is important for India to actually reap its demographic dividend? And would this visit to the US of the Prime Minister also talk about this?
Some ways it will, and I think Indian Prime Minister has always been very, very focused on this issue. But I think global economy is itself passing through a transformation that is very significant. And where we are looking at the whole debate on developed versus developing countries getting much more potent by the day. For example, India becoming a voice of the global south is one such example where India is focusing on how we need to relook at the way we economically govern ourselves and the way global governance, global economic architecture formulates and goes forward. So I think certainly India has always been very active on that front, and India will continue to be active on that front.
The Indo-Pacific region, Dr. Harsh, has become increasingly important in the context of geopolitical dynamics. And Washington also views New Delhi as a strong regional counterweight to China, which has been aggressively, if I may use the word, asserting itself in different parts in the Indo-Pacific region. How do you assess the importance of the Quad in enhancing the India-US partnership, and what potential areas of collaboration exist within this framework?
The Indo-Pacific is going to be the fulcrum of global politics and, of course, the foreign policy priorities of both India and the US. So in that sense, in that context, the Indo-Pacific will be a very, very important variable. And Quad, I think, is a recognition that India-US relationship is not simply a bilateral matter anymore. It's a global engagement where India and the US are sitting together in platforms like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, as well as in the I2U2 in the Middle East. The relationship itself has evolved to a point where we are happy to sit with like-minded countries together in minilateral formats to discuss the future of the world, and in this case, the future of the Indo-Pacific. And in the Quad, we have seen the focus, because it got a renewed focus during COVID, the focus had been on health, on climate, on infrastructure, and increasingly on becoming an economic alternative to China. So I think we are looking at the issues where perhaps China has had an advantage, and the smaller countries, the developing countries, the relatively weaker countries, not had much of an alternative to China. Now I think India, along with Quad partners, hopefully is trying to provide an alternative to that, and that is going to be the focus. But at the same time, hard security issues will also continue to gain a lot of traction in the maritime sector in particular, because of Chinese aggressive posturing in the Indo-Pacific.
The United States has been a key source of technology and innovation for India. Now, how can the two countries collaborate further in the fields of science, technology and research and drive innovation and knowledge sharing?
I think that the roadmap on science and technology that the two nations have embarked upon is quite an ambitious one, and I think it hits the right notes in the sense that ultimately the private sector, ultimately the student community, the academic community, the research community will have to work together, will have to work collaboratively, and will have to engage each other much more substantively than they have done so far. And therefore, science and technological questions move out of the high-end technology spectrum to the day-to-day functioning of our institutions, whether these are academic institutions or our scientific laboratories. And that is where I think the focus should be. And in all likelihood, as we are looking at a research and development partnership, we are also looking at how the two nations can bring in these synergies across a range of sectors. And my own sense is that this is going to be a very, very important factor which drives not only, as we were discussing earlier, the high politics, but also the people-to-people engagement where our researchers, where our academic communities, where our scientists and technologists can regularly work with each other on a day-to-day basis to generate the technologies of the future.
Dr. Harshveep Pant, thank you very much.
You were listening to a discussion on India-US Strengthening Strategic and Economic Relations. The participants were Professor Harshveep Pant, Strategic Analyst, and Gaura Dhawanlal, Anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani.